In the hills of Alabama, a family believed death did not end bloodlines, it preserved them. Northern Alabama, 1935. In the folded shadows of the Appalachian foothills, where mist clung to the valleys long after sunrise and the modern world seemed to falter at the tree line, there existed a place absent from maps and memory alike. A hollow so isolated that even time appeared reluctant to enter it. Locals whispered its name only when pressed. Blackwood Hollow. While the rest of America staggered under the weight of the Great Depression, factories shuttered, farms failing, families uprooted, the Blackwoods endured in deliberate separation. For nearly 70 years, they had sealed themselves away from the outside world, forming a closed society governed by blood, belief, and fear. Their isolation predated paved roads, electricity, and the reach of federal authority. It had begun shortly after the Civil War and hardened with each passing generation. The first official intrusion came on a cold autumn morning. County Health Inspector Thomas Mitchell had been dispatched after months of troubling reports reached Montgomery, accounts of unexplained illnesses, malformed children, and deaths that went unrecorded. No one expected much. Rural poverty was common. Backward conditions were not unusual. But the silence surrounding Blackwood Hollow suggested something deeper. Mitchell's journey ended 3 miles before his destination. The dirt road narrowed, then dissolved entirely into what looked more like a game trail than a path meant for human travel. He continued on foot, pushing through brush and briar until the forest finally opened into a shallow valley. There, scattered unevenly along the slope, stood the structures. Crude cabins. Hand-built. Weathered. Windowless in places. No power lines. No wells. No sign of modern life, despite the Tennessee Valley Authority having electrified nearby counties years earlier. The air carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Everything felt suspended, as though the hollow existed in a different century. Mitchell would later write in his official report that he immediately sensed resistance, not from people, but from the land itself. What he encountered that day would eventually be recognized as one of the most severe documented cases of multigenerational inbreeding in American history. The Blackwood family numbered roughly 64 individuals, spanning 4 generations. Their lineage had remained genetically sealed since 1868, when Isaiah Blackwood, a former Confederate soldier, led his relatives into the hills to escape Reconstruction and what he viewed as moral corruption imposed by the outside world. No outsiders were welcomed. No marriages occurred beyond the family. The consequences were impossible to miss. Mitchell noted that nearly half the population displayed striking physical abnormalities. Faces appeared altered, receded chins, compressed facial structures, eyes set unnaturally close together beneath heavy brows. Many adults stood scarcely 5 feet tall, their limbs disproportionately short, their movements stiff and uneven. But these were only the visible signs. Children well past infancy struggled to speak. Some 12-year-olds possessed the cognitive capacity of toddlers. Mitchell documented multiple cases of extra fingers or toes, digits that had been removed crudely, without anesthesia or medical knowledge. What set Blackwood Hollow apart from other isolated communities, however, was not merely genetic degradation. It was ritual. As Mitchell conducted interviews with the few family members capable of communication, fragments of a belief system began to emerge, one so extreme that his early reports were dismissed by superiors as exaggeration, if not fabrication. The Blackwoods followed a closed doctrine, cobbled together from warped Christian scripture, regional superstition, and practices born of necessity rather than faith. At its center stood Elijah Blackwood, Isaiah's grandson, the undisputed patriarch. Elijah governed every aspect of family life. He decided who lived where, who worked, who reproduced. His authority was absolute, reinforced through isolation and fear. The outside world, he taught, was corrupted, sinful, diseased. To leave the hollow was to invite spiritual contamination. But the most disturbing belief concerned death itself. Among the Blackwoods, death did not end a woman's role in reproduction. They called the practice the returning. If a young woman died before bearing children, or died during childbirth, her reproductive potential was not considered lost. Instead, select male relatives were assigned to perform a ritual reunion before burial. The belief was that through this act, the woman's spirit could be carried back into the bloodline through future offspring. The ritual was secretive, sacred, and enforced. Combined with systematically arranged unions between first cousins, siblings, and, in rare cases, parent and child, the Blackwoods had engineered a genetic enclosure with devastating consequences. Later medical examinations would reveal that over 80% of children born after 1920 suffered from serious hereditary disorders. Many did not survive childhood. Those who did often carried profound physical or cognitive impairments. Yet within the Hollow, these outcomes were not viewed as warnings. They were interpreted as trials. By the time authorities began to grasp the full scope of what was happening in Blackwood Hollow, they were forced to confront a set of questions that Alabama, and much of the nation, was unprepared to answer. Where did religious freedom end? What responsibility did the state hold towards citizens who deliberately rejected it? And how could such suffering persist unnoticed in an era increasingly defined by infrastructure, oversight, and modern governance? These questions loomed unanswered as the investigation deepened. And at the center of it all sat Elijah Blackwood, 67 years old by record, though his bent frame and clouded eyes suggested far more years than that. What he had built in the Hollow was not merely a family. It was a system. And it was beginning to collapse. Elijah Blackwood's age was a matter of record, 67 in the fall of 1935, but his body told a different story. Years of hardship, genetic decay, and untreated illness had bent him inward. His spine curved forward, his movement slow and deliberate. His eyes, pale and clouded, rarely blinked. When he spoke, family members fell silent. As the health department's investigation widened, officials began to understand that Elijah's control over Blackwood Hollow was neither informal nor symbolic. It was systematic, deliberate, total. County archives revealed that when Isaiah Blackwood first disappeared into the hills, he was not alone. He brought with him his wife, 3 brothers, their wives, and 11 children between them. That small group became the seed stock for every life that followed. No new blood was ever introduced. Within 3 generations, the family had expanded to more than 60 individuals, yet genetically, they remained trapped within the boundaries of a single extended household. Every birth narrowed the pool further. Every union compounded the damage. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, one of the few women working with Alabama's Department of Public Health at the time, was assigned to review Mitchell's findings. Her reaction was immediate. This is not just isolation, she later explained. This is enforced genetic confinement. Family members described a rigid internal hierarchy. Elijah decided which men and women would be paired, when unions would occur, and under what conditions. These decisions were framed as divine instruction. Resistance was treated as spiritual defiance. The Blackwoods justified their practices using selectively chosen biblical passages. Stories of Old Testament figures marrying within families were distorted into permission, then elevated into doctrine. Scripture was not studied. It was weaponized. But nothing disturbed investigators more than what they discovered hidden within the main cabin. A ledger. Bound in cracked leather and written in uneven, aging script, the family called it the Book of Returns. It documented, in chilling detail, ritualized unions between living men and deceased women. Dates. Names. Symbols marking whether the ritual was believed to have been successful. According to surviving accounts, the practice began sometime in the 1890s, when childbirth deaths became increasingly common within the family. The dead were not buried immediately. When a young woman died, most often from labor complications, her body was prepared by the eldest women in the family. Washing. Dressing. Anointing. The process was solemn, reverent. No one questioned it. This was how it had always been done. Only later did investigators realize what followed. The ritual, as described by more articulate family members, was intended to preserve the woman's spiritual essence. The belief held that bloodlines could be strengthened, not weakened, by returning the dead to the living through future children. In reality, the genetic consequences were catastrophic. Dr. Whitfield's documentation painted a grim picture. Congenital heart defects were widespread. Neurological abnormalities appeared with increasing frequency. Immune systems were fragile, leaving children vulnerable to infections that should have been survivable. Cognitive impairment was especially prevalent. Nearly 70% of children under 16 exhibited significant developmental delays. Many could not read. Some could barely communicate. Others displayed erratic emotional responses, outbursts, withdrawal, confusion, symptoms later understood as neurological damage rather than moral failing. The hollow itself had been carefully concealed. When outsiders stumbled too close in previous decades, they were either threatened or deliberately misled. Men who ventured into nearby towns for supplies revealed nothing. They paid in old currency, sometimes Confederate notes long since invalid. They spoke only when necessary. Their eyes never lingered. One shopkeeper from the nearest town, 12 miles away, later recalled the encounters vividly. They came twice a year, maybe, he said. Always the same few men. Didn't browse. Didn't talk. Just stood there like they were afraid the walls would hear them. Isolation came with another cost, one measured in graves. Without doctors or midwives, preventable conditions became fatal. Infections went untreated. Labor complications ended lives. Children born with congenital abnormalities, more severe with each generation, rarely reached adulthood. Yet the family did not see cause and effect. They had no understanding of genetics. No concept of inheritance beyond spiritual purity. Their suffering was framed as divine testing, proof of faith rather than warning of collapse. Mitchell noted in his report that when he attempted to explain the connection between close blood relations and illness, hostility spread through the gathered family. Elijah accused me of bringing sickness with my words, Mitchell wrote. He claimed knowledge itself was contamination. By the early 1930s, investigators determined that every living Blackwood was related to every other, often through multiple pathways. Cousins were also siblings. Uncles were fathers. Mothers were aunts. Statistical analysis later estimated the community's average coefficient of relationship exceeded any known case in American medical literature. Higher, even, than the famously inbred European dynasties that collapsed under their own lineage. The realization forced an uncomfortable reckoning. How had this gone unnoticed? How had such practices persisted in a state increasingly defined by modern roads, government oversight, and public health initiatives? And perhaps most pressing, what could be done now? By late autumn of 1935, authorities concluded that observation was no longer an option. Intervention was inevitable. But nothing prepared them for what awaited inside Blackwood Hollow. By early November of 1935, the state of Alabama had exhausted its patience. Health officials, legal advisors, and law enforcement agreed that Blackwood Hollow represented an immediate and ongoing danger, particularly to its children. What remained uncertain was how to intervene without igniting violence or driving the family deeper into the wilderness. No precedent existed for a case like this. Sheriff James Donovan, a veteran lawman with decades of rural experience, was placed in charge of the operation. He later admitted that nothing in his career had prepared him for what awaited them. We expected deprivation, Donovan recalled. Poverty. Maybe sickness. What we found felt like stepping backward through time. On November 14, just after dawn, a convoy of vehicles crawled along the barely passable trails leading toward Blackwood Hollow. Health department trucks. County patrol cars. A small contingent of social workers. Their engines echoed unnaturally loud against the surrounding hills. The sound alone was enough to trigger panic. As the vehicles emerged into the valley, figures scattered. Men, women, and children fled toward the tree line, disappearing into the dense forest as though rehearsed. Some carried infants. Others carried nothing at all. Only one figure remained. Elijah Blackwood sat motionless on the porch of the largest cabin, a shotgun resting across his knees. His posture was rigid. His expression unreadable. Beside him sat Martha Blackwood, his sister-wife, her face marked by the unmistakable signs of generations of inbreeding. Her jaw was small, her eyes misaligned, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped her dress. To investigators, the moment felt surreal. Two worlds stood face to face. "This is Blackwood land," Elijah reportedly declared as officials approached. "God gave us this hollow to keep our blood clean from the wickedness outside. You don't belong here." For a moment, no one moved. What broke the standoff was not authority, but evidence. Medical personnel began assessing the children who had not escaped into the woods. The findings were immediate and alarming. Among the 57 individuals present that morning, 17 were under the age of 12. 12 required urgent medical attention. A 9-year-old boy suffered from a bone infection so advanced it had begun to deform his leg. Twin girls, barely 5 years old, displayed severe untreated hydrocephalus. Several children were visibly malnourished. Others showed signs of chronic illness left unaddressed for years. Even seasoned social workers struggled to remain composed. The living conditions inside the cabins deepened the shock. There was no sanitation. No designated sleeping areas. Filth littered the floors. Food stores were minimal and poorly preserved. Behind the main dwellings, officials made a discovery that silenced the group entirely. A cemetery. 47 graves lay scattered along a wooded ridge, most marked only by small stones. Many were heartbreakingly small, sized for infants and toddlers. Death here was not rare. It was routine. But farther uphill, partially concealed by brush, lay something else. A separate burial ground. These graves were different. All were female. Each marked with strange symbols carved into wood or stone. Unlike the others, these sites were carefully maintained. Cleared. Tended. They were called the returning ones. Investigators noted unusual grave preparations that align precisely with descriptions found in the Book of Returns. Disturbances inconsistent with traditional burial. Evidence suggesting post-mortem handling long after death. The implications were unmistakable. At that point, authorities acted. Elijah Blackwood and 7 adult male family members were taken into custody without further resistance. The remaining adults and children were transported under guard to Montgomery for medical evaluation. The hollow fell silent. What followed was not merely a public health response, it was a legal and ethical reckoning unlike anything Alabama had faced. Medical examinations revealed the full scope of devastation. Dr. Raymond Phillips, leading the pediatric assessments, struggled to summarize his findings. "The concentration of recessive genetic disorders is unprecedented," he wrote. "We are observing conditions that typically appear once in a generation, appearing here repeatedly, simultaneously. Cases of phenylketonuria. Tay-Sachs disease. Rare metabolic disorders previously documented only in isolated academic studies. Among adults, hearing loss was rampant. Early-onset dementia appeared common. Fertility had sharply declined in the youngest generation. Nature itself was resisting continuation. The legal battle that followed forced courts to confront uncomfortable boundaries. Defense attorneys argued that the Blackwoods' religious isolation entitled them to protection from state interference. Prosecutors countered with medical evidence showing undeniable harm inflicted upon children. Judge William Thornton's ruling would become historic. "Religious freedom does not extend to the systematic injury of children," he wrote. "No belief, however sincerely held, may be used to shield demonstrable and preventable suffering." Elijah Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years for child endangerment and abuse of a corpse, the legal term applied to the post-mortem rituals. Other men received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. For the women and children, freedom came with fear. They were being released into a world they had been taught to believe was evil. As winter approached, Blackwood Hollow stood abandoned. Cabins creaked in the wind. The forest began reclaiming what had been sealed away for generations. But the story was far from over. The true cost of isolation was only beginning to surface. By the winter of 1935, the Blackwood case had slipped from newspaper headlines. Another tragedy, briefly acknowledged, then replaced by the relentless churn of the Great Depression. Yet behind the fading public attention, the most difficult work had only begun. Removing the family from Blackwood Hollow was not an ending, it was an unraveling. For the children, survival was only the first step. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield remained closely involved in their care as they were distributed among hospitals, temporary shelters, and foster homes across Alabama. Her notes from early 1936 reveal a sobering reality: the children were suffering from two forms of damage, one genetic, the other psychological. Their bodies carry the weight of inherited collapse, she wrote. Their minds bear the scars of isolation and indoctrination. Treating one without the other is insufficient. The youngest adapted fastest. 5-year-old Sarah Blackwood, born with a cleft palate and mild developmental delays, became a quiet symbol of hope. Within months of placement, she began forming complete sentences. By summer, she showed curiosity about everyday objects, books, mirrors, radios, things that had never existed in the hollow. Her progress stunned caretakers. The older children struggled. Many teenagers had never learned to read or write. Some recoiled from indoor plumbing. Others experienced intense fear when separated from siblings, having been raised in an environment where survival depended entirely on family proximity. Several young women arrived already pregnant, themselves products of consanguineous unions, now carrying children with visible congenital abnormalities. Explaining to them that their suffering was not divine punishment, but a predictable biological consequence, required patience bordering on reverence. Social worker Ruth Henderson described the process bluntly. "You couldn't tear belief out of them," she said. "You had to replace it gently, or they'd break." Medical researchers soon took notice. By mid-1936, specialists from Johns Hopkins University traveled to Alabama to study the Blackwood family. Their findings confirmed what state doctors already feared: this was one of the most genetically compromised populations ever documented. In one branch descending from Isaiah Blackwood's eldest son, researchers identified 6 distinct recessive disorders manifesting within 3 generations. This level of genetic collapse typically unfolds over centuries, wrote Dr. James Harrington in a 1938 paper. Here, it was accelerated by ritualized consanguinity and enforced isolation. The Blackwood case became foundational to the emerging field of genetic counseling. Detailed family trees constructed during the investigation provided rare, devastating clarity, showing how recessive traits compounded, reinforced, and eventually overwhelmed biological viability. For the women, the reckoning was deeply personal. Martha Blackwood, Elijah's sister wife, cooperated extensively with authorities. When doctors explained the true nature of inheritance, witnesses reported she collapsed into sobs. "All those babies we buried," she said. "We thought it was God's will. We were doing it to ourselves." The revelation that the returning ritual was neither sacred nor redemptive, but profoundly abusive, fractured many of the women emotionally. Some had participated unknowingly in preparations that enabled violations they could barely comprehend. Psychological support was limited in 1930s America. Even so, clergy and physicians attempted to help them rebuild a moral framework that had been constructed entirely on fear. Reverend Michael Collins, who worked with several women, described a crisis not just of belief, but of identity. They were taught holiness meant obedience, he said. Now they had to learn that holiness could also mean protection. By late 1936, the state made a controversial decision. The Blackwood children were separated into 17 different foster homes. Siblings were divided intentionally, with officials hoping to break the intense familial dependency that had sustained isolation for generations. Not all survived the transition. Several elderly Blackwoods, unable to adapt to life beyond the hollow, died within months. Others slipped into severe depression, overwhelmed by guilt and the realization that their devotion had produced irreversible harm. The genetic damage did not disappear. Even when Blackwood women later married outside the family, their children still exhibited elevated rates of inherited disorders, less severe but persistent. The legacy had been written into the bloodline. Blackwood Hollow itself was left to the forest. By the autumn of 1936, vines crawled across abandoned cabins. Roofs sagged. Paths vanished beneath leaves. Only the cemetery remained, 47 small markers standing in quiet testimony to preventable loss. Nearly 90 years later, the case still echoes. A comprehensive follow-up study conducted in 1965 traced over 120 descendants of the original Blackwood family. Researchers found something unexpected alongside lingering genetic damage. Resilience. The third generation, grandchildren of those removed in 1935, showed significantly reduced incidence of severe disorders. Education, medical care, and genetic diversity had interrupted the collapse. Sarah Blackwood Johnson became the study's most powerful example. She graduated high school, married, became a nurse. In a rare 1978 interview, she spoke openly about her family's past. "My patients' parents feel shame," she said. "I tell them these conditions aren't punishment. They're realities. And realities can be faced with knowledge." Not all stories ended so cleanly. Records show that at least 14 Blackwood children struggled throughout their lives, some never overcoming developmental limitations. A few returned to isolated rural living as adults, though none attempted to resurrect the practices of their childhood. The Blackwood case reshaped Alabama's public health policy. In 1937, the state launched one of the nation's first rural health monitoring programs, designed to identify isolated communities before tragedy could take root. Legal scholars continue citing Judge Thornton's ruling as a cornerstone in cases where religious freedom collides with child welfare. Medical historians still reference the Blackwood documentation as early evidence supporting genetic science long before DNA mapping existed. But perhaps the most enduring legacy lives outside textbooks. Local oral histories in northern Alabama still speak of the Hollow people, not as monsters, but as a warning. Isolation from knowledge, not evil, destroyed them. Elijah Blackwood died in prison in 1943, unrepentant to the end. Martha lived until 1968, spending her later years speaking to medical students. "I thought purity meant separation," she once told a class. "I didn't understand it meant survival." Today, genetic counseling, medical screening, and education protect families from repeating such collapse. The Blackwood story stands as proof that freedom without knowledge can become a prison, and that silence allows harm to multiply. As Blackwood Hollow disappears beneath the trees, its lesson remains carved into history. Isolation, whether geographic, cultural, or intellectual, can turn belief into destruction. If you watched this story until the end, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end." It tells me you value these deep historical investigations. Subscribe for more hidden histories that mainstream media never covered. And if this story moved you, share it, because remembering prevents repetition. The Hollow is gone, but the echo remains.